Hi, welcome to part 2 of this interview with Dr. Greg Liston as we continue discussing the unique form of community Jesus has for the church, what I call cross-shaped community, and Greg calls Kingdom Come. So Greg, in chapter 5 of Kingdom Come, you say it outlines how the Spirit is gradually and continuously transforming the church into the image of the kingdom through the interplay of imagination, presence, and practice. So what do you mean by that?
It's a good question. So the fundamental question, the Spirit is working, right? And the Spirit is bringing the future back to us. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we participate in that? How do we lean into that? Yeah. To use one of my favorite pastors' phrases, how do we become part and to work together with the Spirit to be able to make that happen?
Yeah.
And so when I was thinking about it and trying to explore in scriptures how these happen, it seems to me there were 3 key components of it. The first one is imagination. We want our imagination to be soaked with this idea of the future is going to be like this. And so rather than being, they talk about having your mind consumed by the by and by, this person who's so heavenly minded that they're of no earthly use.
Yeah.
I just want to say that's our utter rubbish. We want our minds to be consumed with what heaven is and what heaven is going to be like, so that we have this dream of, I am that kind of person. I'm a kingdom person. I'm a person of of life, of truth, of love, of hope. I'm that kind of person, and I long to be part of that community. That's the first part. Yeah. Is imagination. Yeah. The second part is practice. I want to do things now that help me practice to be that kind of person.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so this is probably where your stuff comes in really well, in terms of, I want to learn how to treat people in a way that's going to be like what it's going to be like in the kingdom. And as I do that, there's going to be times when I do it really well, and I'm going to think, yes, I'm growing, and this is fantastic. Yeah. And there's going to be times when I do it really, really awful, and they're also going to help me, because then they motivate me through the Spirit to say, hey, something to be able to work on, something to be able to grow on. And even in our church lives, and I think particularly in our church lives, as we come together and we rub up against each other, we see our coming together as church as practicing for what the kingdom is going to be like. So we're listening to sermons. Why? Because we want to learn how to listen to the voice of God. We sing and we worship together. Why do we do that? Because we're practicing for the coming kingdom, where we're going to worship all day and every day. It's going to be awesome. And so all of this is practice, so we're doing these things in order to practice. So imagination, practice, and the last one is presence. Is that I think for all of our effort, it doesn't make any difference if the presence of the Spirit and the presence of the King, Jesus, is actually there. That actually enables transformation. So it's the recognition of the presence and the ability to, lean into that presence. So that's the hardest one and the most wishy-washy one to be able to define, but it's probably the most important. That it's actually the genuine presence of the Spirit that enables actual transformation.
Yes. Yeah.
So it seemed to me it was the interplay of those 3 things, imagination, presence, and practice, that sort of transforms us towards the community that we're heading towards.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, you've already kind of touched on some examples, but I know in your book you've got some very specific examples of how this has worked out. Do you want to give us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are lots and lots of examples, and so in the book particularly, I looked through the whole epistle, Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, and explain how the whole of that is actually an example of this. But probably the best example is communion, or taking the Lord's Supper. Yeah. And so when we do that, we should see those 3 things at play: imagination, presence, and practice. So imagination, what we're doing when we're taking communion, among other things, but what we're doing when we're taking communion is imagining this future that's coming, which we're going to be together with Christ at his wedding banquet. And this is going to be this extraordinary time. And what we're doing, we're getting like a foretaste. It talks about this foretaste of this wonderful thing that happened. So if our minds aren't filled as we're taking communion with this foretaste, this idea of what it's going to be like in the future, we're sort of missing the point a little bit. Yeah. So that would be the first point. Fill our minds when we're taking communion of this future banquet, this incredible thing that's going to happen. Secondly, we practice. So, I mean, this is what they talk about. Communion is a practice that the church goes about. But what we want to do when we take communion is to actually practice that. So what is that future banquet going to be like? Well, I hope that it's a time of both incredible solemnity, do you know what I mean? But also incredible joy. Sometimes I think with our communions, Ken, we're really good at the solemnity and we kind of miss out on the joy, which is a bit sad, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I wonder, the other thing about communion, wedding banquets, is they're times of deep relationship. And what we've done is we've got these little goblets of drink and little pieces of bread, and we say that that's communion, but that's nothing like what it's going to be in the future. And so I think perhaps we could think about how we go about doing these practices so that what we're actually doing is actually practicing for what it's going to be like. I want to practice for this future wedding celebration, so when I get there, I can enjoy it and love it and be part of it as much as I can. And then the third point is the presence, this whole idea that when we take the bread, when we take the cup, that Jesus is there in the midst of that. Yeah. And obviously there's been lots of debates over that over the years with regard to exactly how Christ is in the bread and how Christ is in the cup. And I mean, in the book I talk about all of those different debates and then say, I think mostly they're irrelevant. The key point is not how he's in the cup or how he's in the bread. That really the key issue is that he is in the cup and he is in the bread. However that happens, that he's actually there and he's actually transforming us through it. So I think communion, as the center of the church's life and worship, is a fantastic example of exactly what we're talking about here: imaginations, presence, and practice. And you could go through into that about everything. You could talk about the sermon, you could talk about the singing, you could talk about home groups and life groups, you could talk about the bit before church, the bit after church, you could talk about Wednesday home groups, you could talk about what you do. All of it is, bringing these three things together: imagination, presence, and practice. That this life is like, this is the gym, do you know what I mean? Which trains us for the rugby ground, which is coming when we actually get to play the game. Yeah. Or if you're not a rugby player, then this is the green room, where we practice our scales and, do our training, so that eventually we're going to go out into the concert hall and play, and Jesus, the conductor, is going to walk out. What we're doing now is preparing for that, and we prepare for that through imagination, presence, and practice. Yeah. Does that make sense?
No, that's great, Greg. Yeah. That's a real helpful way, and I think certainly adds a lot of depth to what we do. But for instance, when we take communion in church and these other parts of church.
So how does it match up with your stuff?
Yeah, well, I haven't thought of it in terms of the ceremonies we practice in church, but it's really helpful because I think, as a pastor, it'll help me practice those ceremonies more deliberately with those three aspects in mind. Where I've probably concentrated more is the pragmatics of daily life, which I think also prepares us and gives us a glimpse of, or hopefully gives us a glimpse of, the kingdom come. And for example, I think where that's probably perhaps best seen is when we, with the Spirit's help, work to transform a situation. So whatever that may be, whether it's an argument that's going on between two individuals, or somebody's really struggling in life through poverty or injustice or something, and we work to bring a transformation, to bring a reversal of that situation, which we can't do by ourselves. We need God's help in it. But even if it's just a little incremental change that's happened, it's a change that reflects the coming kingdom of heaven on earth. And so we catch this glimpse of it as we work towards the kingdom, but in the here and now.
Nice.
It's like I like to use it in movie terms of a preview of the coming kingdom of heaven.
Lovely.
And we can see that with our own very, very own eyes, and others can see it too. And hopefully too, the watching world sees those little transformations. So it becomes, it points to the coming kingdom, it points to Jesus who is coming, who is real, but it's doing so in quite practical kind of ways of these reversals, these transformations that happen hopefully on a daily basis, even in very mundane things, but also on larger scale conflicts and situations of injustice that we might want to get involved in and work towards.
Yeah, lovely. No, that's really nice. I like the way that you talk about it. It spans from the smallest, the argument that you had with your wife in the morning on the way coming to work. I didn't, but it would be an unusual day when I didn't have one of those, but still, you understand what I'm saying? And through to, church splits or something way on the other side of world wars or those kinds of things as well. So it's actually it's something. This is why I like the fractal image. Do you know what I mean? Sort of. So it comes the same kind of patterns: death, resurrection, self-giving love, a reversal of power. Those kinds of things. That those things exist in the smallest parts of life, all the way through to the biggest parts of life, and they exist in church practices, but they also exist in the bits before church and the bits after church and the bits the bits that you do on your way home, the bits in your family, whatever it is, that all of those things they fit together, and all of them are means that the Spirit uses to transform us into what it is that we're heading towards.
Greg, what I'm going to be doing beyond this is interviewing some pastors, church leaders who have been involved in this very divisive issue of the vaccine mandates, the impact upon church, the requirement to decide whether or not to use vaccine passes, which has been very difficult for I think pretty much every church in New Zealand.
Difficult, yeah.
So how might an understanding of cruciform, cross-shaped community help the church overcome such challenges, do you think, Greg?
Yeah, that's such a good question, but that is not a small question, is it? So I think just some ideas to get us going. Firstly, I actually think this is the answer. Let's go back a bit. I think that one thing we can do is we could look at the challenges that the church has faced over the last little while and say, oh, that sucked, that's awful, and do our very best to sweep them up and put them under the carpet and try and ignore them as much as possible. I honestly think that that's a mistake, and I think that this very, very difficult time that we've been through, and I acknowledge so much. I've watched some pastor friends of mine go through it and think, that has just been so difficult. Both the exhaustion of having to deal with changing plans but then also having groups in your church, some that are saying, well, you should be acting this way, and others saying that you should be acting this way, and then you trying to find a middle ground between them. It's incredibly challenging. But what we get to do is we either get to embrace and lean into that challenge or lean away from it. And I think what I'm trying to say, and I think what you'd be trying to say as well from your Christ-like conflict and the cross-shaped community and cruciform lives kind of themes that you're talking about, is that actually what we need to do is to, rather than leaning away from them, we lean into them and to say, how is the Spirit using these very, very difficult circumstances that we've been given to enable us to be able to grow and develop? How can we use this so that we can love people who are different from us? How can we do this so that we can work together with people who love Jesus like we do, but see the world in very different terms from the way that we do? How do we understand what unity and diversity actually means in a much better way? Because the future kingdom is going to have people who are way more different from us than simply someone who opposes vaccine mandates or someone who supports vaccine mandates. They're going to be much more different than that. So this is training for what the future kingdom is going to be like. And so I think the point, and this is why what the podcast you're doing is so wonderful, is leaning into it rather than leaning away from it is the posture that we need to be able to adopt. And that hurts. Because I kind of think we're all a bit tired, and we're all just wanting it to be over and to go back to the way things were, even though the way things weren't exactly perfect. But I think what we have to do is we have to, imagination, presence, and practice. Firstly, trust in the presence of God. I don't have the energy to do this, God, but Jesus, you live in me. Give me what I need to be able to do, to be able to lean into this and grow into it. Practice. I'm not going to get this right the first time. I'm going to struggle as I go and try and engage with these people who are different from me, or, try and get these two vastly different groups of my congregation together so that they can actually understand each other. How do I do that? I'm not going to get it right the first time. I'm probably not going to get it right the second time. Neither are they. And do you know what I mean? And that's okay, because that's what practice is. You know, if you make a mistake in your maths while you're practicing, it doesn't matter. It's the exam that matters, and the exam is still coming. But then this imagination. Do you know what I mean? Fill your head with this future kingdom where it's full of life and truth and love and hope, and say that's what I'm working towards. And allow that to be able to motivate you and point you in the direction that you want to go, and allow that to be able to give you the energy and enthusiasm to keep going even when things become difficult. Yeah. They're the kinds of things I think that pastors could and perhaps should. I'm not a pastor now, so I shouldn't say should, but that's what I'd be encouraging and pointing them towards. And I hope I know I talk to some people who go through very, very difficult circumstances, you know, like cancer or losing a baby or those kinds of things. And you know, your first response is always, that's so hard, that's difficult. You know, you've gone through incredibly difficult circumstances, and I really, really feel for you. And then the second point, do you know what I mean, probably which comes 6 or 7 weeks after the first point, is don't waste it. You know, this has been really, really hard. Don't waste it. Use it to be able to grow. Use it to be able to become everything that God wants you to be. And maybe that's the right response to people who are going through these challenges, or pastors that are going through responses. Firstly, that's been really hard, and I'm so sorry that you've had to go through this, and it's been really, really difficult. And the second point that comes 6 or 7 weeks after the first point, don't waste it. You know, don't waste it in your congregations. Don't waste it in your life.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Greg. That's been awesome. Some wonderful insights into Cross-Shaped Community, into the Kingdom Come. And I can't wait to read the book coming out in August. Be looking out for that. I presume you can get it through all the usual means.
Yes, it's coming out with TNT Clark. So I will say it's an academic book. Yeah. So I'm sure most pastors will be able to cope with it, no problems at all. Yeah. And it tries to be as practical as it possibly can be, but it does use some big language. Yeah. But I mean, I'm really proud of it, Ken, and I'm looking forward to it coming out.
Yeah. Well, ngā mihi, Greg. Really appreciate your time. Thanks heaps. Okay. Join me for the next Cross-Shaped Community podcast, when I'll be interviewing Pastor Steve Worsley of Mount Albert Baptist Church to hear how his church went about keeping community when their unity was severely tested by the 2021 vaccine mandates, requiring New Zealand churches all over the country to determine who and how many could attend church based on their COVID-19 vaccination status. My name is Ken Keyte, and we've been exploring cross-shaped community, the unique form of Christian community that flourishes during testing times.